My name is Madeline Carter. I am 32 years old, and on the night of my sister Olivia's wedding, she slapped me across the face and poured red wine all over my dress, while 300 guests watched in silence. My parents rushed to her side, not mine, calling me selfish and humiliating me further in front of everyone. I stood frozen, wondering if I would ever escape being the forgotten daughter, until the sound of a helicopter shook the sky and changed everything. What would you do if your entire family turned against you on the most important night of their lives? Stay with me, because this story will show how one moment of truth can flip a lifetime of shame into strength. The chandelier light shimmered across the ballroom at Willow Creek Estate in Chicago, bouncing off the crystal glasses and marble floor, as if the room itself was holding its breath. More than 300 guests filled the tables, their voices, a low murmur of conversation and clinking silverware. I stood near the edge of the dance floor, holding a small plate, trying not to draw attention. It was Olivia's day, not mine, and I had promised myself I would do everything to keep it that way. I stepped forward when she beckoned me closer. Her gown trailed several feet behind her, layers of white satin and delicate beadwork catching every glint of light. She looked like a queen in her castle, eyes bright, with the thrill of being the center of it all. For one moment, I thought perhaps she wanted a kind gesture from me, maybe even a hug, maybe a thank you for all the quiet help I had given behind the scenes. As I leaned in, the heel of my shoe caught on the edge of her long train. I felt the subtle tear, almost imperceptible, a few beads slipping free and hitting the marble with a faint tick. My stomach sank. Before I could pull away, her hand cracked against my face, a sharp sting that made my cheek blaze. The sound echoed louder than the music had only moments before, and the room went silent. Wine splashed cold across my chest. Olivia had grabbed a glass from a passing tray and flung it onto me, the deep red soaking through my cream-colored dress, dripping to the floor in a spreading stain. My hands trembled as I pressed them against the fabric, heat rising to my face. Olivia's voice rang out, high and cutting. "You ruined my wedding dress. You always ruin everything." A murmur rippled across the room. Some guests gasped, some pressed hands to their mouths. Others simply stared, waiting to see what would happen next. I stood rooted in place, my pulse thundering in my ears, unable to form a word. I tried to speak, my voice barely audible. "Olivia, I am sorry, it was an accident." Her eyes narrowed, shining with anger. "You are always careless, always making everything about you. On my wedding day, you cannot even give me a hug without destroying something." I glanced down at the small tear near the hem of her gown. Hardly visible, but in that moment it felt like I had shattered the entire evening. My cream dress clung heavy with wine, my cheeks still stung, and 300 pairs of eyes bore into me. Then I heard my mother's voice. Linda rushed forward, arms wrapping around Olivia, her face tight with fury as she looked at me. "What were you thinking, Madeline? How could you embarrass your sister like this?" My father Richard joined her, his jaw clenched. "This is Olivia's wedding. She has been preparing for this day her entire life, and you cannot control yourself for one moment." I swallowed hard, shame burning in my throat. It was an accident. I barely touched her dress. But Olivia sobbed against my mother's shoulder, her voice rising loud enough for the nearest tables to hear. "She is jealous. She cannot stand that today is about me. She wanted to humiliate me." Linda tightened her embrace around her youngest daughter, her eyes flashing with disappointment as she stared me down. "We told you not to make this day about you, and here you are proving us right." Richard shook his head, his words clipped and sharp. "This is unforgivable." The guests whispered again, their voices swirling through the grand hall like an echo I could not escape. Some looked at me with pity, others with judgment. My skin prickled under their gaze, and I felt myself shrinking smaller and smaller until I barely recognized the woman standing there. The band had stopped playing, the servers stood frozen with trays in their hands, even the chandeliers seemed to throw harsher shadows across the marble floor. I wanted the ground to open and swallow me whole. I turned, slightly desperate to walk away, but Olivia's voice cut through the silence once more, sharp and triumphant. "Do not walk away. You need to apologize to me right here in front of everyone." The demand hung heavy in the air, and I felt 300 eyes waiting for my response. My throat tightened, my hands clenched at my sides, and I stood motionless, unsure if I had the strength to speak at all. I could not bring myself to answer, not in that ballroom filled with judgmental eyes, not with my parents glaring at me as if I had committed the worst crime a daughter could commit. The demand for an apology echoed in my mind, and it dragged me back further than I expected to the very first time I understood what it meant to be invisible in my own family. I was 6 years old, sitting cross-legged on the carpet of our living room in Evanston, clutching the ribbon from a spelling bee prize. I had won first place, beating out every kid in my class. I wanted to show my parents, to see them beam with pride. Olivia was only 2, then curled on our mother's lap, and as I held out the blue ribbon, my mother smiled absently, distracted by Olivia tugging at her necklace. My father murmured a polite "well done" without looking up from his newspaper. A second later, the room burst with applause when Olivia managed to say a new word. She was praised for babbling while my ribbon fell to the floor unnoticed. It became a pattern so strong I could trace it like the lines on my palm. Every piano recital, every science fair, every late night of studying that earned me another A, it all slipped through the cracks. Meanwhile, Olivia was adored for her curls, her bright laugh, the way she commanded attention just by entering a room. They called her their little jewel, the light of the Carter family, while I stood to the side and smiled as if that nickname did not sting. I tried harder. I thought if I did more, achieved more, I could win what came so easily to her. In middle school, I was chosen for the advanced math program. I brought home the letter, waiting for recognition. My father skimmed it, nodded, then turned to remind me to help Olivia with her homework so she would not fall behind. The years piled on top of me like bricks. At 12, I was still hoping. My birthday that year was a summer afternoon filled with relatives, balloons in the yard, a cake with my name in pink frosting. I had been excited, thinking maybe this time the spotlight would be mine. I remember standing by the picnic table as my uncle asked my father how proud he must be of me. Richard laughed, clapping Olivia on the shoulder. He said in front of everyone that Olivia was truly the pride of our family, that she had the looks and the charm that would carry her anywhere. My smile froze in place, cheeks burning as cousins stared, some whispering. No one corrected him. No one noticed my 12-year-old heart cracking open under the weight of those words. That night, I sat on my bed with unopened gifts at my feet. I stared at the fading balloons outside my window and realized that no matter how many ribbons or medals I collected, I would always be the shadow beside the shining star. I told myself it was fine, that someday they would see me. But deep down, I knew the truth. To them, I was useful, dependable, the one who held things together, but never the one to be celebrated. Even when I became a teenager, it did not change. In high school, when I stayed up nights studying for exams, Olivia would prance into the kitchen and ask if she looked pretty in her prom dress. My mother would gush, my father would nod approvingly, and no one asked how my test went. I remember one winter evening sitting at the kitchen table with college brochures spread in front of me. I had dreams of leaving Illinois, maybe studying in Boston or New York, someplace where I could be seen for who I was. My father walked in, glanced at the brochures, and asked if I had saved enough from my part-time job to cover application fees. Then Olivia skipped in wearing a new scarf, and both of them lit up, showering her with praise for looking like a model. The message was clear. No matter how hard I worked, Olivia's smallest gesture, her smile, her charm would always outweigh me, and I let it sink into my bones, shaping the way I carried myself. Quiet, careful, trying not to draw attention, because attention never ended well. As I grew older, I learned to mask the hurt with composure. I graduated near the top of my class, walked across the stage to collect my diploma, and looked for their faces in the crowd. They clapped politely, then rushed home to help Olivia pick out a dress for a school dance. I told myself to stop caring, but that need for approval dug into me like a splinter. Sitting in that ballroom now, wine dripping down my dress, I felt like that 12-year-old again. Standing in front of relatives who saw me as less, hearing my parents defend Olivia as if she could do no wrong. Their voices blended with memories, their accusations tonight indistinguishable from all the other times they had overlooked me. Olivia's sobs grew louder, theatrical, echoing against the high ceilings. My mother stroked her hair the same way she had when we were children, whispering that she was their treasure, their pride. My father's hand rested firmly on Olivia's shoulder, his glare fixed on me as though I was an intruder. I wanted to disappear to dissolve into the marble floor, but I stood frozen, my mind looping back to that birthday party years ago. The sting of those words, "Olivia is the pride of our family." The weight of their favoritism pressed down on me with every breath. And as I looked at the guests whispering behind their hands, I knew they were witnessing not just a sisterly spat at a wedding but the truth of a family dynamic that had existed all my life. I was the forgotten child, the one expected to endure in silence while my sister basked in the light. I closed my eyes for a moment, my cheek throbbing, my dress ruined, my parents' words circling like vultures. I was not that 12-year-old anymore, I reminded myself. But the wound they had carved so long ago still bled, and tonight they had torn it open in front of everyone. And in that silence, with Olivia wailing and my parents clutching her like a precious jewel, I realized I would never be able to escape the label they had given me. Not here, not with them, not unless something in me changed. When I turned 18, I thought freedom would taste like fresh air, but all I felt was the weight of responsibility pressing down harder than ever. While my friends planned road trips before college, I started working full-time at a small accounting firm in downtown Chicago. My father had been hospitalized after a heart scare, and the bills stacked up faster than our mailbox could hold them. Tuition for Olivia's private high school was due, and somehow it was my name, not my parents', written on every check that left the house. I told myself it was temporary. That once Dad recovered, once Olivia graduated, things would ease up. But months turned into years, and my life became a cycle of paychecks disappearing before I even tasted them. I moved into a tiny studio apartment with paper-thin walls and a view of the alley. Every morning, I rode the L train to work with a knot in my stomach, knowing part of my salary would go straight to the hospital and the rest toward Olivia's endless demands. There were nights I sat at the kitchen table in our family home, receipts spread out like battlefield debris while my mother stirred tea and said nothing. I longed for one word of gratitude, but all I ever heard was how strong I was, how reliable, how much Olivia needed me. It was not praise, it was expectation carved into my skin. Olivia, meanwhile, floated above it all. She lived as if the world owed her sunshine. Designer handbags appeared in her room, dresses she wore once and abandoned in the closet. When I asked how she could afford them, she would shrug, batting her lashes, saying that credit cards were made for girls like her. I watched her dig herself into holes while my back bent under the strain of filling them. I remember one summer evening when she was 19. She waltzed into my apartment, unannounced, tossing her shoes on the floor, scrolling her phone with a smile. I was hunched over my laptop, calculating medical bills, exhaustion etched into my face. She leaned against the counter laughing and said she had just maxed out another card on a weekend in Miami. I snapped, then asked her if she realized who paid the interest, who made sure the collection calls never reached our parents. She looked at me with amusement, tilting her head like I was being dramatic. Her lips curled into that effortless smile that had always undone everyone else, and she said, almost singing, that I was nothing but a walking ATM. The words hit me harder than any slap could. I sat frozen, my fingers digging into the wooden table, her laughter echoing in the walls. For a moment, I thought she might take it back, but she only laughed louder, twirling a strand of hair before leaving with a careless wave. I stayed there long after she was gone, the phrase burning into my memory. A machine with legs, that was what I was to her. Still, I kept paying. Still, I kept saving them from consequences they had earned. When Dad's second hospital stay came, I worked overtime until my body ached. I brought soup to Mom, signed checks negotiated with insurance companies while she praised Olivia for visiting the hospital with flowers. There were nights I cried into my pillow, hating myself for never saying no. But every time I imagined refusing, I pictured my parents' disappointment, their voices sharp with reproach. I had been conditioned for so long to carry the weight that putting it down felt impossible. Friends drifted away. Invitations to dinners and birthdays faded because I was always too busy, too broke, too tired. I envied their carefree laughter, their vacations, their ordinary family dinners. My life revolved around debt and duty while Olivia sparkled at parties, her photos lighting up social media with captions about living her best life. Even when I managed to save a little, emergencies swallowed it whole. A flat tire on Olivia's car. A surprise bill from the hospital. Rent for my own apartment creeping higher while I quietly skipped meals to stretch my paycheck. No one noticed. No one ever asked how I was holding up. The only time anyone seemed to remember me was when money was missing. I recall a Sunday brunch where Mom mentioned Olivia's latest shopping spree. I muttered that maybe she should slow down, and silence fell around the table. My father frowned, reminding me that family comes first, and Olivia was under a lot of stress. I sat there with eggs growing cold on my plate, realizing that to them I was not a daughter but a resource. That phrase, walking ATM, stayed with me in every decision, every sacrifice. It carved itself deeper each time Olivia smiled sweetly and asked for another favor. I wanted to scream to tell her I was drowning while she floated, but the words always lodged in my throat. As the years passed, I learned to compartmentalize, to bury the resentment under layers of numbness. I told myself it was worth it, that someday things would change, that Olivia would grow up and my parents would finally see me. But beneath the surface, the anger pulsed, waiting. And now, standing in that ballroom with wine soaking into silk and shame crawling up my neck, I could hear her voice again, teasing, dismissive, calling me a machine. It mingled with the whispers of 300 guests, with my parents scolding, with Olivia's theatrical sobs. The memory slammed against the present, reminding me that this humiliation was not new, it was simply louder, more public. They had trained me for this role all my life, and I had played it without protest. But as I stood frozen under their judgment, a part of me wondered if the machine inside me could finally break. It was 4 years earlier when I first met James, on a crisp autumn afternoon at a technology conference in downtown Chicago. The ballroom was filled with men in sleek suits, women in sharp blazers, the air thick with ambition and caffeine. I remember standing near the back, clutching a paper cup of lukewarm coffee, wondering why I had come at all. My company had sent me for networking, but I felt like an imposter among the buzzing conversations about venture capital and innovation. He approached me quietly, not with the overconfident stride I had come to expect from men in those circles, but with a calm curiosity. His tie was slightly crooked, his hair a little messy, and he had a notebook in his hand instead of a drink. When he asked me what I thought about the keynote speaker's prediction for artificial intelligence, his eyes were focused, genuinely interested in my answer. It startled me. He was not looking at my clothes, not assessing me as if I were a deal to be measured, but listening. We ended up tucked into a corner of the lobby for nearly an hour, discussing everything from emerging software trends to how exhausting it felt to constantly prove ourselves in rooms that demanded polish above substance. His laughter was low and easy, his mind sharp but never cutting. When he told me about the small startup he had founded with 2 college friends, I expected the usual bravado. Instead, he admitted it was risky, that they had just enough funding to survive another year, but that he believed in what they were building. His honesty made me feel lighter, like I was finally breathing clean air. We started meeting after that, first under the guise of professional networking, then with a quiet shift into something personal. He took me to a hole-in-the-wall diner in Lincoln Park on our first official date, not a polished steakhouse, and when I confessed, I was embarrassed by my family. Always dismissing my choices, he reached across the table, squeezed my hand, and said that my worth had nothing to do with their approval. No one had ever told me that so plainly. Introducing him to my family, though, was like throwing him to wolves. We invited them to dinner at a restaurant in Oak Brook, and from the moment he shook my father's hand, I saw the disapproval in their eyes. James wore a jacket that was slightly worn at the cuffs, his shoes scuffed from long days at the office. My mother's smile was tight as she asked about his family background, whether his parents were connected in business or society. When he explained that his father was a retired electrician and his mother taught middle school English, her eyes flickered with disdain. Olivia giggled behind her wine glass, whispering to my cousin that he was cute but clearly out of his league. My father asked pointed questions about the startup, each one dripping with skepticism. How stable was it really? Could he provide a secure future? My mother leaned back in her chair, her voice cool, telling me later that night not to expect James to bring me a bright future. Those words sank deep, echoing in my head even as James walked me home, apologizing that he had not impressed them. I told him it did not matter, but a part of me ached with shame that my parents could not see what I saw so clearly. Over time, the tension between my family and James only grew. At every holiday dinner, there were side comments about his car being too old, his apartment too small, his clothes too plain. They measured him against Olivia's boyfriends, men who flaunted luxury watches and stock portfolios. James never fought back. He simply smiled politely, answering their loaded questions with calm dignity. His patience was a balm, though I could see the hurt in his eyes when my mother ignored him in favor of Olivia's latest fling. Despite their coldness, my love for him only deepened. He believed in me when no one else did, celebrated every small win in my career, and listened when I cried over the burdens I carried. He told me I was not an ATM, not a machine, not the forgotten daughter. He said I was brilliant, resilient, worth more than I could imagine. In his presence, I was not invisible. I remember one night in particular after my parents had dismissed him again during a family gathering. We sat on the roof of his apartment building, the Chicago skyline glittering in the distance. He wrapped his arm around me and told me that their approval did not define us. That the life we were building together would speak louder than their judgment. His voice was steady, his eyes unwavering. I leaned into him knowing that for the first time in my life I had someone who chose me fully. Still, the sting of my mother's warning never quite left me. It echoed in quiet moments when bills piled up or when Olivia bragged about dating wealthy men. Do not expect James to bring you a bright future. It was meant to plant doubt, to remind me that in their eyes I was foolish for loving a man without pedigree. But every time I looked at James, every time he showed up at my door with takeout after a long day or fixed something in my apartment without being asked or encouraged me to apply for promotions, I thought I did not deserve. I knew they were wrong. He might not have the glittering surface they craved, but he had something they could never buy with all their money and shallow praise. He had integrity. He had love. That was the beginning of the quiet war between my family's expectations and my heart's certainty. And as I replayed that memory in the middle of the wedding ballroom with Olivia's venom still fresh on my skin and my parents' scorn ringing in my ears, I realized that their voices had been trying to drown me for years. Yet James had always been the one voice that pulled me back to the surface, reminding me of who I truly was. The day before Olivia's wedding arrived with a kind of forced brightness. The rehearsal at St. Matthew's Church in downtown Chicago staged like a performance more than a preparation. The bridesmaids were gathered in a flutter of chiffon and chatter, Olivia at the center, like a jewel surrounded by velvet. She moved with calculated sweetness, smiling at me as if nothing had ever passed between us, her voice sugary as she asked if I could help straighten her veil, adjust her bouquet, fetch her shoes. Every request came wrapped in politeness, yet edged with mockery. I felt more than heard. When I bent down to pick up the train of her gown, she leaned toward one of her bridesmaids, whispering something that sent them into stifled laughter. I caught only fragments, words about how I always looked like I had walked out of a clearance rack at some office supply store. The sting was sharp but familiar. Olivia had a way of cutting deep without raising her voice, like she had spent years perfecting the art of humiliation. James was in San Francisco on business, his flight not due to land until noon on the wedding day. He had promised he would make it back in time, his voice warm on the phone the night before, as he assured me nothing could keep him from standing by me. I clung to that promise as if it were armor. My parents circled me during the rehearsal like guards keeping watch over an unpredictable prisoner. My mother pressed her manicured hand against my arm and said softly yet firmly that I must remember not to cause embarrassment tomorrow. My father's eyes were cool as he reminded me that this day was about Olivia and her future, not me and whatever bitterness I carried. Each word landed like a stone stacking higher until I felt buried under their expectations. We lined up at the back of the church, the bridesmaids adjusting their hair, Olivia glowing under the praise of her friends. She turned to me suddenly, her smile wide and sharp, her voice loud enough for everyone to hear. She told her friends she hoped the bridesmaid dress I wore would not make her look bad, since I always had a talent for turning anything elegant into something cheap. Laughter bubbled around her, subtle but slicing, and heat rose to my face. I swallowed hard, keeping my eyes fixed on the polished wooden doors ahead. My hands tightened around the small clutch I carried, nails pressing into the fabric as if I could ground myself through pain. No one came to my defense. Not the bridesmaids, not my parents, not even the pastor who awkwardly cleared his throat and hurried the group forward. I stood alone, invisible and exposed at the same time, the unwanted sister painted as a burden before an audience of strangers. When the rehearsal finally ended, Olivia wrapped her arms around our parents, gushing about how perfect everything would be tomorrow. She posed for pictures, her smile dazzling, her laughter practiced. I lingered at the edge of the frame, cut off in every sense. My mother leaned into Olivia, whispering loud enough for me to catch that her darling girl deserved nothing less than perfection. My father agreed, his hand on Olivia's shoulder, pride spilling from his every word. As they all walked ahead, I followed a few steps behind, my heels clicking against the marble floor, each sound a reminder of the distance between us. The city lights outside flickered through the stained glass windows, and I felt a hollowness spread inside me. This was their stage, their spectacle, and I had been cast as little more than a shadow. Later that night, alone in my apartment, I replayed every word, every look, every laugh. I sat on the edge of my bed, the dress I would wear tomorrow, hanging on the door. It was simple navy blue, chosen carefully so as not to outshine, but still dignified. Yet Olivia's voice haunted me, her sneer about my taste, her certainty that I was incapable of elegance. My mother's warnings echoed too, like a mantra drilled into me. Do not cause shame. Do not ruin her day. I thought of James then, of his steady presence, his voice grounding me. I imagined him walking into that ballroom tomorrow, cutting through the noise with his calm assurance. The thought steadied me, but only slightly. For now, the weight of my family's disdain pressed hard against my chest, and I lay back on the bed staring at the ceiling, wondering how many more years I would be asked to carry it. The night was quiet except for the city hum outside my window. I closed my eyes, willing myself to sleep, but Olivia's laughter kept echoing, mingling with my parents' praise, wrapping around me until it felt like a noose. I turned on my side, clutching the pillow, and whispered James's name as if it were the only thing keeping me from breaking. The rehearsal had ended, but its aftertaste lingered bitter in my mouth. Tomorrow the performance would begin, and I already knew my role by heart. The ballroom at Willow Creek shimmered with golden light and crystal chandeliers, but all I could feel was the sting on my cheek and the burn of wine soaking into my dress. Olivia buried her face against my mother's shoulder, her sobs echoing like a performance on stage. She shook as though she were the wounded party, trembling in my father's arms as he stroked her back and whispered soothing words. Guests leaned forward in their seats, whispering to one another, hungry for scandal. My father turned on me, his voice sharp enough to slice through the music that had faltered into silence. He said I had embarrassed the family again, that I always thought only of myself, that I had never once considered what my actions did to those around me. His words rang with finality, as if he had been holding them for years, waiting for the right moment to deliver the verdict. My mother joined him, her hand resting protectively on Olivia's arm, her eyes burning into mine. She demanded to know why I could not hold my temper for one day, why I had chosen my sister's wedding of all occasions to humiliate them. Her tone was not of a mother speaking to her daughter, but of a judge addressing the guilty. I wanted to scream that I had done nothing, that I had been struck, soaked, and left standing in ruin, but my voice lodged in my throat. Around me, guests shook their heads, some pitying, some disgusted. I felt their stares crawl across my skin like insects, heavy and suffocating. Olivia pulled away from my mother just enough to flash a victorious glance in my direction, her tears still falling but her eyes sharp, gleaming with triumph. She had flipped the moment, turned herself into the victim and me into the monster. I stepped back, searching for air, for space, for someone to meet my gaze with understanding. My Aunt Caroline, sitting near the edge of the room, leaned toward her husband and whispered something. Though she tried to keep it quiet, I caught the words. She said it was a shame that the eldest had never been truly loved in that family. The phrase cut through me, both a wound and a strange form of validation. She had seen it, even if she whispered it in pity. I swallowed hard, my eyes burning. My hands trembled as I held them against my sides, the fabric of my ruined dress clinging cold and damp. Olivia whimpered into my mother's embrace, and the image burned itself into the minds of every guest present. She was fragile, precious, wronged. I was reckless, selfish, cruel. The band picked up their instruments again, trying to restore order, but the rhythm was hollow, forced. Laughter and chatter trickled back into the room, though it was flavored with curiosity and gossip. I could feel the judgment lingering behind me like smoke, the kind that clings long after the fire has gone out. My father's words still rang in my ears. Selfish, thoughtless, a disgrace. I thought back to the nights I worked double shifts, the checks I wrote to cover his medical bills, the tuition I paid for Olivia when she had squandered her scholarships. None of it mattered here. None of it would ever count in their eyes. They had chosen their jewel, and I was the flaw in the setting. I turned toward the exit, my steps unsteady, the chandelier lights blurring in my vision. I felt every head follow me, every whisper chase after me, as if I carried scandal in my very shadow. The air outside was cold, sharp against my skin, but it was relief compared to the suffocating warmth inside. I leaned against the stone pillar of the estate, pressing my palm against the wet stain on my dress, trying to steady my breathing. I wanted to leave, to vanish into the night and never return, but something anchored me there. Perhaps it was the cruel comfort of knowing that, if I left, the story would be sealed as they wanted it. Olivia, the tragic bride with a cruel sister. My parents, the noble protectors, and me, the villain. So I stood still, letting the night air cut into me, replaying every word, every look, every accusation. Alone, abandoned, with nothing to hold on to but the truth that no one else cared to see. Through the glass doors, I saw Olivia smiling faintly again, already basking in the sympathy of those around her. My parents flanked her, their pride intact, their loyalties declared for all to witness. In that moment, under the cold night sky, I knew exactly where I stood in their story. I was not the daughter, not the sister, not the pride. I was the scapegoat, the one they would always turn against. I pressed my hands against the stone, grounding myself, fighting the urge to break. The music swelled again inside, and laughter filled the hall as if nothing had happened, but for me everything had. The celebration continued without me, the doors closing tight, leaving me outside, exiled in every sense of the word. The cold air steadied me just enough to walk back inside, though the weight of 300 stairs seemed to meet me at the threshold. Conversations quieted for a heartbeat, and then resumed in hushed tones louder than any shout. I felt the eyes of strangers and relatives alike slide over me, measuring, judging, savoring the scandal. Some gazes softened with pity, but others glinted with a cruel satisfaction, as if my humiliation had become their evening entertainment. I caught the sound of a woman near the dessert table whispering that it was always the older ones who turned bitter when they lost the spotlight. Another laughed quietly, saying she had seen it coming since childhood, that Olivia had always been destined for better. My stomach twisted, but I kept walking, my heels clicking against the marble floor as though I could drown them out. At the far end of the room, Daniel stood with a glass of champagne in hand, his eyes fixed not on the guests but on his bride. His expression was unreadable, caught between the charm of a man trying to keep a party together and the furrow of doubt carving its way into his brow. Olivia noticed his hesitation and slipped her arm through his, leaning her head against him with practiced innocence. She whispered something I could not hear, but her smile was wide enough for the crowd. Then her voice rose pitched to reach the tables around her. She said I had only come tonight to make everything about myself, that I could never stand to see her happy without trying to ruin it. Her words floated across the room like poisoned confetti, light enough to pass as banter, sharp enough to wound. My father's face darkened, and my mother's lips pressed thin. They both moved toward me, their steps heavy with expectation. My mother told me to apologize, to end the spectacle, to think of the family's reputation. My father's voice followed, demanding that I put aside my pride for once and bow to my sister's day. The words were not a request, they were a command delivered before the ears of every guest present. I opened my mouth, but the room tilted. The murmur of voices swelled again, people leaning close to one another, eyes darting between Olivia's tear-stained cheeks and my clenched jaw. It was as though they were watching a play, each waiting for my line, the cue that would satisfy their hunger for closure. Olivia pulled closer to Daniel, her lips brushing his ear, but this time her words carried just far enough. She laughed softly and said that I had always been jealous that I could never afford dresses like hers, that tonight was just another attempt to steal what was not mine. Her tone was sweet, but the venom dripped through every syllable. Daniel froze. His smile faltered and his eyes flickered from her face to mine. He shifted his glass to the side, his knuckles tightening around the stem. For the first time that evening, I saw something crack in his expression. Not anger, not defense, but disappointment, heavy and raw, sinking into the space between them. I felt a rush of conflicting emotions, relief that anyone might finally see her mask slip. Fear that it would all vanish if he blinked and chose to believe her again. My mother urged me sharply to speak, to apologize now before I made things worse. My father raised his hand slightly as if to silence the whispers of the crowd, his gaze burning through me with unspoken orders. But I stood rooted, my throat dry, my palms damp. The words would not come, not the ones they wanted. Around me the noise of the ballroom pressed in laughter, forced conversations resuming, but every so often a glance darted my way, followed by a smirk or a shake of the head. I felt as though I had been carved out and left on display, no longer a person, but a lesson in failure. Olivia's laughter rang again, this time, softer, private, but Daniel did not laugh with her. His eyes lingered on me a moment longer, his jaw tight, his shoulders squared. It was enough to make me breathe, even if it was shallow, even if I knew the night was far from over. I lowered my gaze, steadying myself as best I could, and let the silence between us speak louder than any apology could. I turned on my heel, ready to leave the ballroom before the weight of their judgment crushed me completely, when a low rumble cut through the chatter. At first, it was faint, distant, like a storm gathering at the horizon. Then it grew louder, rattling the glasses on the tables, vibrating through the floor beneath my shoes. Heads lifted, voices paused mid-sentence, and the air shifted as if the room itself was holding its breath. The sound intensified, a deep mechanical roar that pulsed through my chest. Guests pushed their chairs back, standing to peer through the tall windows that overlooked the estate's lawn. Curtains swayed as a sudden draft swept inside, carrying with it a thrum that was unmistakable. A helicopter. The chandeliers trembled ever so slightly as the noise swelled. Forks and knives clinked against plates. Dresses rippled in the manufactured breeze, pushing through the cracks of the grand doors. Someone gasped loudly, then another voice called out to ask what on earth was happening. I felt the collective confusion ripple across the room. Men adjusted their ties nervously, women clutched their champagne flutes. A child pressed her hands over her ears and shrieked at the piercing whir. All around me, guests abandoned their conversations and pressed toward the glass, jostling for a view of the unfolding spectacle. The rumble grew into a pounding rhythm, insistent and commanding. The doors were pushed open and a gust of wind barreled through, tossing napkins and rattling centerpieces. I caught a glimpse of Olivia, her mouth slightly open, her hand tightening on Daniel's arm. Her expression flickered from confusion to irritation, as if this intrusion dared to pull her spotlight away. Outside lights swept across the dark lawn, illuminating the manicured hedges and perfectly arranged floral arches. The helicopter descended lower, its blades slicing the air with a force that made the ground itself seem to quake. The pristine white tablecloths at the outdoor bar snapped like sails in the wind, and startled guests shielded their faces as a whirlwind of dust and petals tore through the courtyard. My mother clutched her pearls, her eyes wide with fear. My father muttered angrily about someone ruining Olivia's day again, his voice strained against the roar of the machine. Olivia herself let out a frustrated cry, covering her hair with one hand while demanding to know who thought this was funny. I stood rooted near the doorway, the storm of wind whipping my dress against my legs. The sound swallowed every thought, every insult, every command that had been thrown at me all night. For once, the room was not filled with whispers about my failures, but with gasps of awe and confusion, none of it centered on Olivia's carefully crafted perfection. The helicopter dipped lower, so close now that the glasses on the nearest tables toppled, spilling champagne in golden arcs. Men shouted, trying to guide women away from the draft, while photographers clutched their cameras, lenses fogging in the chaos. A server stumbled as the wind knocked a tray from his hands, crystal shattering across the marble. I raised my arm against the force of the air, strands of my hair lashing across my face, my skin tingling from the rush of power roaring above. The machine hovered just feet from the emerald lawn, its landing skids tilting as the pilot steadied the descent. The thrum of the blades became unbearable, drowning every other sound until it felt like the sky itself was splitting open. Then, with a final controlled push, the helicopter touched down on the manicured grass. Dust and rose petals swirled together in a violent dance, whipping into the ballroom through the open doors. Guests cried out, shielding their eyes with menus and shawls. Children ducked behind their parents. The wind pressed against me, but instead of staggering back, I leaned into it, my breath catching in my chest. Through the haze of debris and spinning light, the outline of the cabin door became visible. My heart raced, not from fear but from an anticipation that felt too large to contain. Around me the world seemed to hold still, waiting for whatever or whoever would emerge from that storm of power. The cabin door swung open, and through the storm of dust and petals a tall figure stepped out. His suit was dark and tailored, the kind of sharp elegance that seemed to slice right through the chaos around him. James descended the skid with the unhurried confidence of a man who knew every eye was locked on him and did not flinch under the weight of it. My chest tightened as I watched him straighten his shoulders, squared his gaze unwavering. He did not glance at the crowd or the fluttering mess of Olivia's veil tugged by the wind. His eyes found me instantly, and in that single look the roar of the helicopter seemed to dim, the clamor of guests fading to nothing. He crossed the grass with deliberate steps, each one cutting through the murmurs of confusion. Men leaned closer to whisper to each other, women clutched their clutches to their chests. Daniel stiffened, his hand still caught in Olivia's, while my parents stood frozen as if trying to piece together why a helicopter had landed at their carefully curated wedding at all. When James reached me, the air around us seemed to hush. He slipped out of his suit jacket and, without a word, draped it gently over my shoulders. The fabric was warm from his body, soft against the chill of my wine-soaked dress. My breath caught as he lifted a folded handkerchief from his pocket, and with the kind of tenderness no one had ever offered me in that family, dabbed carefully at the stain on my neckline. I could hear my mother gasp, her voice trembling as she muttered something about impropriety. Olivia's sharp intake of breath carried even louder, a hiss of disbelief. But James did not look at them. He stayed steady in front of me, his touch calm, his presence a wall against the storm that had consumed me all night. Then his voice, clear and commanding, rose above the murmurs. "This is my fiancé." The words sliced through the ballroom like a blade. Silence fell so abruptly that even the clink of glass outside seemed deafening. My heart hammered in my chest. Guests gawked, some with jaws slack, others with eyebrows raised so high they seemed to vanish into their hairlines. Olivia staggered back a step, her face drained of color, her mouth opening and closing without sound. Daniel's brow furrowed as he turned sharply to her, confusion etched across his features. My parents stiffened, their eyes snapping to each other in a silent panic before shifting back to James as if begging for a clue to what game he was playing. But James did not hesitate. His hand found mine, steady and sure, grounding me in a way I had not known I needed. He turned slightly to the crowd, his voice measured, resonant, carrying to every corner of the hall. "Some of you may not know me, though I believe a few of you have heard of my company. We just closed our most recent round in Silicon Valley. Valuation came in at $500 million. The collective gasp was nearly physical, a wave of air rushing back into the room as people tried to comprehend the number. $500 million. I saw heads tilt as guests whispered names of venture capital firms, others fumbling to check their phones as though to confirm if they had missed the headline. James gave the slightest smile, one I had come to know well, the one that held both pride and humility. "We signed with one of the largest players in the valley this morning. Which is why I was late. But I promised her I would not miss today. Not for anything." He looked back at me, his hand tightening just enough for me to feel the weight of his vow. My throat ached and I blinked hard against the sting in my eyes. For once, I was not the background, not the burden, not the invisible machine they had trained me to be. I was seen wholly and without apology. Olivia let out a brittle laugh, the kind that cracked at the edges. "This is a joke, right?" she said loudly, her voice shrill against the stunned quiet. Madeline doesn't have a fiancé. Certainly not one with money. She's just making this up to ruin my day. But no one laughed with her. Not Daniel, whose eyes had darkened with suspicion, not the guests who could barely tear their gaze from James, not even my parents whose faces had gone pale and rigid. My father's mouth opened, then closed, his lips, pressed so tightly they blanched. My mother's fingers twisted in her clutched the pearls at her throat, rising and falling with shallow breaths. They looked like statues frozen in the collapse of a truth they had never once considered. James ignored the outburst. He shifted closer, wrapping his arm firmly around my shoulders, his voice softer now but carrying just as strongly. This woman beside me is the one I've built my life with. She has stood by me through every uncertain night, every rejection, every sleepless hour. And now that everything is turning, I want the world to know she is not just mine. She is my future. The words wrapped around me like armor, and for the first time that evening I did not feel the sting of humiliation. I felt power. I felt chosen. I felt loved in a way that no spotlight, no staged applause for Olivia could ever touch. The ballroom remained silent, heavy with awe and disbelief. Glasses hung frozen halfway to lips, forks paused midair. The only movement was the subtle tremble in Olivia's hands as she clutched the skirt of her gown, her nails digging into the satin. Somewhere in the back, someone whispered, "My God, he's telling the truth." Another voice followed. "Isn't that the startup that just made headlines?" The ripple of recognition spread, and the silence gave way to gasps, murmurs, fragments of excitement. Olivia's face twisted as she realized the attention was no longer hers to command. And in that moment, standing in the center of the storm with James's arm around me and 300 eyes locked, not on my shame but on our strength, I understood that everything had shifted. The balance, the narrative, the power. It was no longer Olivia's day. Not entirely. And my parents knew it too. Their rigid expressions told me so. They had lost control of the story they had been writing since my childhood, and they did not yet know what it meant. But I did. And as the whispers grew louder, filling the air with awe and disbelief, I let myself breathe for the first time all night. James straightened his arms, still firm around me, and turned his gaze directly toward my parents. His voice carried no anger, only a sharpness that cut more deeply than shouting ever could. "You raised a daughter who has carried the weight of this family on her back, yet tonight you allowed her to be humiliated in front of everyone." My father's jaw clenched, his shoulders stiff, but he said nothing. My mother gave a small gasp, her hand clutching at the pearls around her neck. James did not give them room to answer. Instead, he stepped closer, his eyes steady, his words precise. "You looked at her and saw someone you could dismiss, someone whose silence you mistook for weakness. But I see her. I see her strength, her brilliance, her heart. And I will not stand here and let you pretend that what happened tonight was anything less than cruelty." The crowd was frozen, caught between shock and fascination. Olivia, still clutching Daniel's arm, let out a sob that drew every eye back to her. "I didn't know who he was," she cried, her voice rising, tears smearing her makeup. "I didn't know he was important." James's expression did not change. His reply was calm, almost surgical. "That is the problem. You only value people when you believe they can give you something." My stomach tightened at his words because they landed not just on Olivia but on my parents too. And I knew they felt it, the sting of truth they could not disguise. My father tried to interject, his voice gruff. "That's enough, young man. This is a family matter." James did not waver. "A family matter," he echoed, his voice cutting through the air. "Families are supposed to protect, not tear each other down for sport. You stood by while your elder daughter was struck and ridiculed on the most public day of your lives. You stood silent while she was reduced to nothing. That is not family, that is betrayal." The room rippled with whispers again, sharper this time, judgment spilling through the guests. Some turned their heads toward my parents, others watched Olivia's tears with skepticism instead of pity. Olivia's face twisted, desperation spilling through her voice. "You don't understand," she whimpered. "She has always tried to take what is mine. She wants to ruin everything for me." The lie struck a nerve deep inside me, but before I could speak, James's hand pressed gently into mine, steadying me. His gaze returned to Olivia, unwavering. No, what she wants is the respect you all have denied her. Respect should not be earned by being louder or crueler or more dramatic. It should be the baseline of how you treat a human being. The words seemed to hang in the air, impossible to ignore. Daniel shifted uncomfortably, his arm loosening from Olivia's grip, his eyes darting between her and James as if pieces of a puzzle had finally started to fit together. My mother tried again, her voice trembling. "You don't know our family. You don't know what you're talking about." James's reply was sharper now. "I know enough. I know that you chose to believe that belittling your own daughter was acceptable because you thought she would never fight back. I know you convinced yourselves that her silence meant consent, but it wasn't. It was survival." My breath caught at the word because it was the truth I had never dared to speak aloud. Survival. He had named it, and for the first time the shame shifted from me to them. Olivia's tears thickened into rage. She stamped her heel against the floor, her voice cracking. "This is absurd. None of this matters. Who even cares about her?" The words spilled out before I could stop them, my voice steady, almost cold. "The problem isn't who he is. The problem is that you believed I was never worthy of respect." The silence that followed was heavy, almost suffocating. Every guest seemed to hold their breath, the truth ringing louder than the music, louder than the whispers, louder than Olivia's sobs. Olivia's lips parted, but no sound came out. My father turned away, his face shadowed with something that looked uncomfortably close to shame. My mother's hand shook as she reached for a chair, lowering herself down as though the weight of the words had physically knocked her off balance. Daniel stepped slightly back from Olivia, his expression unreadable but no longer soft with trust. The guests shifted in their seats, the lines between pity and judgment now clearly drawn, and I knew in that moment that nothing would ever return to how it had been. The spotlight, the power, the story had shifted, and my voice had finally entered the room. My parents tried to gather themselves, clinging to a dignity that no longer existed. My mother raised her chin, forcing a brittle smile as she looked around the ballroom. "We should all remember that tonight is a celebration," she said, her voice shaking as she tried to steady it. "Families have disagreements, but love will prevail." The words landed flat, swallowed by the silence. The guests did not smile back. Instead, their eyes moved from her to my father, to Olivia, to me, and then to James. It was not sympathy they wore on their faces, but judgment, the kind that stripped away every excuse. My father cleared his throat, his hand curling into a fist at his side. "Let's not blow this out of proportion. Emotions run high at weddings. That's all this is." But no one looked convinced. The weight of what had been said lingered, and for the first time my parents stood exposed before people whose approval they valued more than anything. Daniel finally broke his silence. His voice carried easily across the room, measured but sharp. "I married you today, Olivia, but I never knew you could be this cruel." Olivia turned toward him, eyes wide, mascara smudged. "No, Daniel, you don't understand. She provoked me. She wanted this. She has always wanted to take from me." He shook his head slowly, his expression filled with something far more painful than anger. "Disappointment. I believed in you. I thought I knew your heart. What I saw tonight is not the woman I promised my life to." Her hands reached for him, clutching at his sleeve, her voice breaking into pleas. "Daniel, please, it was a mistake. I was upset, you have to believe me." But he looked away, his jaw tight, his silence louder than her begging. Around us, the guests whispered openly now. I caught fragments of their words, each one cutting into the fragile image my parents and Olivia had spent years polishing. Cruel. Ungrateful. Always favored. Poor Madeline. I stood still, my hand anchored in James's, his presence steady beside me. For years I had been invisible in these gatherings, the quiet shadow trailing behind Olivia's glow. Tonight, the roles had reversed. I felt the shift in every gaze that turned toward me, in every guest who looked at my parents with disappointment instead of admiration. My mother tried once more, her voice trembling as she forced out a laugh. "We must not let this ruin the evening. Please, everyone, enjoy yourselves." But her words only deepened the discomfort. No one raised a glass. No one returned her smile. The illusion had shattered, and there was no stitching it back together. Olivia's sobs filled the silence, sharp and desperate. Daniel's face remained set, his eyes clouded with something final. He did not comfort her, and that absence was louder than any declaration could have been. James leaned toward me, his voice low, meant only for me. "You don't have to stand here any longer." I nodded, my body heavy with exhaustion, yet light with a strange new clarity. Together, we began to move. As we stepped forward, the crowd reacted in unison. Conversations cut short, chairs shifted. Guests rose silently, parting to the sides, creating a path that had never been offered to me before. Not a single person blocked our way. Not one dared to stop us. My heart pounded as I walked, each step echoing with years of swallowed words and buried hurt. I kept my chin lifted, not in defiance, but in quiet resolve. The air felt different, thinner, sharper, as though even the walls of the ballroom understood that something had changed. I could feel Olivia's eyes burning into my back, her sobs growing louder, as if volume alone could pull the spotlight back to her. My parents stood frozen, their carefully built facade collapsing in silence as we walked past. James's hand tightened gently around mine, and I let the warmth of his grip guide me forward. I did not look back. The murmur of the crowd followed us to the doors, but no one stopped us. The room that had once caged me now seemed to bow, opening a way I had never imagined possible. And when the night air hit my face, cool and sharp against my skin, I felt the weight of years begin to lift piece by piece. The path ahead was clear, and for the first time it was mine. The rotors were still turning when we reached the steps, their steady thrum pushing cool air across my face and lifting the edges of my ruined dress. James kept my hand in his and helped me up into the cabin. The pilot gave a thumbs up and an understanding nod, then returned to his instruments. Behind us, the lawn glowed under floodlights, the floral arch bent from the wind, the white chairs scattered like shells along the shore. I glanced back once. Through the glass doors, I could see Olivia near the threshold, hands pressed to her mouth, tears streaking lines through the makeup she had worn like armor. Daniel stood a step away with his jaw set, torn between duty and the truth he could no longer ignore. My mother and father were statues on the terrace, heads high, eyes wide, as if posture alone could hold together what had come undone. Closer to the lawn, guests clutched their shawls and programs, speaking in quick bursts, their faces lit with the shock of a story they would repeat for years. James leaned close so I could hear him over the noise. He told me we were leaving now. He said I did not need to look back. I breathed out, slow and careful, and settled into the seat. He lifted the headset over my hair and adjusted his own, then touched my shoulder with a light pressure that steadied me more than any seatbelt could. The cabin sealed with a firm click. The pilot spoke through the headset's voice, even and professional, and the helicopter began to lift. The ground slipped away, the lawn shrinking, the terrace folding into a marble rectangle, the chandeliers inside becoming small points of gold. For a heartbeat, I saw Olivia turn her face toward the sky, her gown flaring like a white sail in the wind, and then she was only a shape among many. The estate receded behind us. We rose above the dark ribbon of the river and the streets stitched with headlights. Chicago opened beneath us like a map I knew by heart. The Ferris wheel gleamed along the lakefront, the grid of neighborhoods stretched out in careful lines, the towers downtown caught the last of the light, pink at the edges and blue at their cores. The sound that had terrified the crowd became a steady heartbeat at our backs. James rested his hand over mine where it lay in my lap. He did not speak right away, and he did not need to. It was enough to watch the city widen and feel the tightness in my chest loosen enough to let the cold air trapped in my lungs finally leave. I realized my fingers had stopped trembling. I thought of the girl with the blue ribbon lying forgotten on a living room carpet. I thought of the 12-year-old standing beside a cake while her father announced that someone else was the pride of the family. I thought of the young woman writing checks at a kitchen table while her sister laughed about Miami and new handbags and limits on cards that were never limits for her. I thought of every time I left a room so they would not accuse me of taking up too much space. And then I thought of the moment in that ballroom when my voice had finally risen clear and calm, and I had named the thing they never wanted named. The city floated beneath us. The lake was a sheet of dark glass. In the headset, I heard the pilot speak to the tower, then heard his low reply. James shifted closer and told me we would circle once before heading toward the downtown pad near the river. He asked if I was all right. I told him I was not sure what I was, but for the first time in years, I was not afraid of saying it out loud. He smiled just enough that I could feel it more than see it. He said this was only the first of many nights where I would choose myself. He said I had done something brave. I let the words sink in and did not push them away. Below us, the streets brightened as traffic lights changed in patterns only the city understood. We passed over a park where late walkers tilted their heads to watch us cross the sky. For a moment, it felt like I had stepped outside the old script, the one that had cast me as the reliable background, and into a new one that I could write myself. I closed my eyes and pictured the ballroom again, not to relive the pain, but to set it down. I saw Olivia's hand raise and the way the room paused between my humiliation and her victory. I saw my mother's quick judgment and my father's careful dismissal. Then I saw James placing his jacket over my shoulders and the words he gave me in front of everyone, not as a shield for himself but as a recognition of me. He had not saved me. He had stood beside me while I saved myself. We banked gently toward the river, the skyline sliding across the windows like a slow parade of steel and glass. The helicopter drifted above bridges strung with lights and boats cutting pale wakes along the water. I felt lighter with every mile we put between us and the estate, as if the air itself was washing sticky wine and old shame from my skin. I thought about what would come next. There would be calls, of course. There would be the version of events told by people who had never bothered to hear mine. There would be family dinners I would not attend, holidays I would spend elsewhere, records of payments that proved nothing of love. There would also be quiet mornings where I would drink coffee without rehearsing apologies, and evenings where I would say no to requests that used to feel like obligations. There would be a boundary that did not exist before tonight. It would be mine, and I would hold it. James squeezed my hand again. He said the pad was a few minutes out. He told me his team would wait with a car. He added that if I wanted to talk, he was ready to listen, and if I wanted to sit in silence, he was ready for that too. I laughed softly, the sound surprising me. I told him I wanted to sit here and count the lights on the river. He said then we would count them together. We hovered for a moment at the edge of downtown. The glass towers rose like dark mountains and the streets below looked like veins of fire. I thought of the lesson that had taken me 3 decades to learn. Blood is not proof of love. Tradition is not proof of goodness. The people who truly love you will stand beside you when you speak, not ask you to stay quiet so the picture looks clean. The pilot announced the approach. The pad glowed ahead in a neat circle of white. We descended with a soft dip and a shiver through the cabin, the rotors feathering the air, the city's heartbeat growing louder beneath us. When we settled, I felt an odd mixture of relief and anticipation. The old chapter had closed mid-sentence and, for once, I did not need anyone else to finish it for me. We climbed down and the night wrapped around us, cooler by the water, carrying the smell of the river and a hint of rain. A car waited at the edge of the pad. James guided me toward it, then paused, and looked back at the sky where the last color of evening slipped into blue. He asked if I was ready to go home. I told him I was ready to go forward. Before I got into the car, I turned one more time toward the city and let myself speak to the part of me that had stayed small for so long. I told her she had done enough. I told her she could rest. I told her we would not shrink again to fit inside rooms that demanded our silence. If you are listening and some part of this feels familiar, if you have watched favoritism twist a family or felt the sting of being dismissed by the people who should have protected you, I would like to hear your story. Share what you have seen and what you chose to do. If this journey meant something to you, stay with me for the next one. Leave a comment, tap the like, and subscribe so we can keep building this space where our voices are not small. Your presence helps more than you know. The city moved beside us as the car pulled away from the pad. Up above, the helicopter lifted again, its blades cutting the night until the sound thinned and faded. I leaned back and threaded my fingers with James's. The quiet settled like a soft blanket. I did not feel invisible. I did not feel lesser. I felt whole, and the sweetest revenge of all was not triumph over anyone else but the simple decision to live exactly at my full size.